That's soon, but first, the Coalition isn't about to let the government forget the Australia Day fracas that saw the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader bundled from a Canberra restaurant by Australian Federal Police. The Opposition's written to the police demanding an investigation. Earlier in the day, the AFP rejected an inquiry but says now it's evaluating the request. The Aboriginal Tent Embassy protests claimed the scalp of Prime Ministerial Media Advisor Tony Hodges for telling a union official that the Opposition Leader was nearby, and that led directly to the ugly scenes at the restaurant. The Prime Minister insists he acted alone. Shortly, I'll be joined by the Attorney-General, Nicola Roxon, but first, this report from political editor Heather Hewitt.
It's 4 days now since we first saw these angry images of the Australia Day Aboriginal protests in Canberra. 4 days of debate over who was at fault. One head has rolled, the Prime Minister's media staffer, Tony Hodges, but the opposition thinks that's not enough. And while the public may well have decided they've had their barbecue stopper and it's now time to move on, our politicians and the media have not.
The opposition regards this as a very serious matter. We are suspicious of a cover-up. We are more than suspicious that the public are not being given the full story.
This is the most serious security breach involving our nation's top leaders since the 1970s.
I've obviously formed the view this was a grave error of judgment by Mr Hodges.
It should be unthinkable for a security breach of this nature not to be fully investigated by the Australian Federal Police.
For it to be insinuated that I would play some role in disrupting an event to recognise Australians who had performed miracles during a natural disaster is deeply offensive.
It's a measure of the way politics works these days, and like it or not, we're having it served up to us again at the very start of a fresh political year. The constant he said, she said, tit for tat in the 24-hour news cycle, the aim to tactically outmanoeuvre the other and, if deemed necessary, cry foul to the Federal Police.
We don't know whether a crime has been committed, but in the circumstances there seems to be a body of material which makes that at least distinctly possible. We do know that the Prime Minister's security was breached, and we do know that that breach of the Prime Minister's security was the direct result of a sequence of events initiated by Mr Hodges. That alone is a serious matter that requires thorough investigation.
Never mind that all the initial signs today pointed to the AFP not wanting to be involved, when it issued a statement this morning saying there was no evidence of a criminal act and it was not conducting an investigation. But the opposition isn't letting go that easily. Former media advisor Tony Hodges' admission he'd passed on information that tipped off the protesters is one thing, but the opposition's real target, as always, is Julia Gillard.
I think the opposition feels, quite rightly, that there's a fragility about Gillard, about her office and about the government, and that the opposition will continue to attack that fragility in the hope that they can get into government sooner rather than later.
Despite general praise for Julia Gillard's concern for Tony Abbott on Australia Day as protesters closed in, the gloves are now off in a battle arguably of Labor's own making, and not for the first time. A young media advisor going beyond his job description.
I think the lesson for people working in these sorts of jobs is to not confuse themselves with the actual players. They're not players in this, they should be basically the humble servant of their political leaders. When you try to get involved and manipulate media events in the way that it seems some people try to manipulate that event, things can come a cropper, and in this case they came a cropper in a very big way on the front page.
Yes, I think this is an interesting recurring theme in this government. And it even preceded Gillard. It was happening in Rudd's staff as well. So there's a real problem with the Labor Party. They need to look at their political staff because, quite frankly, they're not up to it.
The opposition focus today has turned to when Julia Gillard first knew of her staffer's involvement. She maintained she was told a day later.
The fact that nothing happened for 24 hours is something that we regard as suspicious. And we would like the investigation that the AFP undertakes into who knew what, when did they know it, and what did they do about it, to focus on that, among other issues, within the Prime Minister's office.
Let's be very clear about this. There were a range of allegations flying around on Friday morning, and each and every one of them was investigated by my senior staff, and I was presented with all of the facts.
Look, I think it's odd but probably credible. I think, to give them their due, the senior media officer and the communications director of the Prime Minister's office were entitled to take the time to find out exactly what did happen, so that when they briefed the Prime Minister on that matter, they were giving her the facts and the full facts.
I would have thought the wise thing to do would be to have said nothing on this matter and let the commentators focus in on the real issue, which is the flagrant breach of the law by those protesters who, on the basis of hearsay, went off and posed a threat to public order.
That hasn't happened, nor has there been any evidence of the opposition's claim of the most serious security breach in more than 30 years. After all, the leader's whereabouts on Australia Day were widely known throughout the media, and public protests do go with the political territory.
Thinking back, there have been large numbers of protests against Prime Ministers for years and years and years. John Howard, wherever he went, was always confronted with people who were protesting about asylum seekers. Bob Hawke had to put up with protesting airline pilots.
What's different is that Julia Gillard heads a minority government, and it seems that means any slip-up, large or small, is magnified by an opposition hungry for power. We haven't heard the last on this one.
Heather Ewart with that report.